So it is with great honor that I get to introduce you to Dr. Shana Poplack, a distinguished professor at the University of Ottawa. Dr. Poplack obtained her PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania in 1979. She was recruited at the University of Ottawa in 1981 as an assistant professor and quickly went up the ranks. She was the holder of the Canada Research Chair in Linguistics, Chair 1 from 2001 to 2022. And she has received numerous prestigious awards and recognition throughout her prolific career, such as the most recent title of Chevalier by the Order of Palmes Académiques by the Ministry of Education in France in 2004. She has so far supervised 21 PhD students, 34 MA students, and 11 postdoctoral fellows. She has received more than $7.8 million in research funding from various national and international granting agencies. And she has published 47 book chapters, 51 refereed journal articles, 10 conference proceedings, and delivered 114 invited keynote and plenary addresses. Her work has been cited more than 25,300 times. It is truly an honor to have you here and to have you share with us your work on speaking while aging. So thank you. The floor is all yours now.
Oh, yes, thank you. And thank you especially for giving us the chance to road test this research, which is a whole new avenue for us and is still in its very earliest stages. So really, any suggestions for improvement from you guys would be gratefully received. So let me just start by introducing my collaborator, Nathalie Dion, and also the members of Team Golden who have worked on this project, sitting right over here. And I guess it is no news to anybody in this room that the world's population is aging at a vertiginous rate. This is really an extraordinary demographic change. And happily, it has fueled interest from researchers of all stripes, including many of you affiliated with the Life Research Institute. So now we know more about what goes on in our golden years than ever before. But one fundamental area of human behavior, one that I would argue is particularly critical to overall well-being, has been neglected, and that is language. Are speech capabilities affected by the same kinds of physical and cognitive declines that have been documented in later life? Well, the widespread use of Elderspeak, by which I mean the simpler, louder, slower speech you hear being addressed to older adults, often peppered with terms of endearment like sweetie or la petite madame, and often perfectly well-meaning, would certainly suggest so. But this kind of baby talk for adults conveys a decline ideology, obviously. And like other forms of ageism, it has been shown to have a variety of negative effects. So it would make sense to ask, is it even warranted? And the answer would depend on the actual linguistic behavior of older adults, but we don't really know an awful lot about that. So this is the context for this new multi-level project that my team and I have initiated at the Sociolinguistics Lab. So just by way of introduction, let me say that we are sociolinguists, which means that we study the way language is actually used on the ground by ordinary people in their social context. And at my lab, we've spent decades studying the everyday speech of local francophones and anglophones, trying to understand how and why languages change. And to do this, we go into speech communities and we engage principled samples of speakers in casual interactions. And over the years, we've recorded millions of words of spontaneous speech from hundreds of individuals of different ages, social classes, and linguistic and geographic backgrounds. And all of this material has been transcribed, computerized, and organized into databases that we call corpora. And the ones most relevant to today's talk are these, because fortuitously enough, 135 of the speakers sampled for these earlier projects happen to have been aged between 65 and 104 at the time the data were collected. And these are the subjects for our new work. And that work is, of course, based on everyday speech, as in the example you're going to hear.
I remember, she told you an amusing story with the shoes. I remember we were engaged and I was in the store and the customer came in for a pair of pants or something like that.
In her store.
In the father's store.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Got it? Okay. All right. Where are we? You want to start all over?
And she looked down below and there were didn't have the size. So she got up on the counter with a razor blade in her hand and a pen. And she is up there with a pair of pants and she's scraping off the size of the pair of pants and put down the size. And I'm looking at the guys down below looking at her, and she gives him the pants. I say, "What are you doing?" She says, "Okay, he'll come back tomorrow. I'll have the size."
This might be a good time to say that all of our data were collected with the full consent of our participants in compliance with Tri-Council ethical considerations, and to protect their identities, every name you see here is a pseudonym. So the minute you start paying close attention to actual speech, you're going to come face to face with its fundamental property, and that's inherent variability, or alternate ways of saying the same thing, as in this example.
And when I hear these mothers say, "Well, I can't do nothing with my child," oh, I want to cry.
But then next semester I can't take anything extra because we have a stage at the end, like it's a compressed semester.
Or this one from French.
Peut-être que si je les relirais, là, ce serait mieux. Admettons, si on voulait s'envoyer un avion avec papier à l'autre classe, on pourrait. Là.
So sometimes one of these ways is non-standard or stigmatized, such as choice of the conditional after C in French, or double negation in English, and these are, of course, quite salient. But just as often, they're below the radar, as in this English example, with and without the complementizer that.
The next day, Eddie was called into his office, and he was politely told that he had no more job, and he was politely told he was excommunicated.
There are different forms of future temporal reference in French.
Mais le français, c'est sûr, ça n'arrivera pas demain, là. Non, non. Là, il y en a une des blessés qui va revenir, là, comme demain.
Là, je commence demain.
We call these linguistic variables, and they have two crucial properties. The first is that the choice among them is never random, even though it may look that way to the casual observer. Instead, it's robustly conditioned by a set of implicit constraints deriving directly from the linguistic and the extralinguistic context. And we construe this set of conditions as the structure or the grammar underlying the variability. Now, mind you, this is not a prescriptive grammar that I'm talking about, a grammar that tells you how to speak correctly, but a descriptive grammar, which captures the way people actually do speak. And this implicit community grammar is not taught anywhere, but amazingly, it is followed remarkably faithfully by members of the speech community. And as you'll see, adherence to this community grammar is going to serve as a key metric in our research on speaking while aging. The other important thing to know about variability is that it's a necessary precursor to change. Sociolinguists conceptualize the progress of change as the gradual encroachment of one variant on its competitors until it eventually ousts them. So you start with X, you end up with Y. And we can observe this happening synchronically, that is, at a single point in time, by mapping variant selection across age cohorts. Now, under the critical period hypothesis, that language stops developing at some point around puberty, the standard inference has been that the language of an 85-year-old analyzed today would represent the language spoken at the time they finished, spoken, or say, in the mid-20th century, which would be the time they finished acquiring it. So differences across age cohorts can be interpreted as stages in language change, with younger generations driving it and older ones resisting. And this inference has become a veritable cornerstone of variationist linguistics, and many crucial findings and principles have emerged from adopting it. But one consequence of this traditional focus on youth as drivers of change is neglect of what's going on with the elderly. Usually they are just lumped together in a single cohort defined by chronological age, usually 65 and over. The question is, are they really as homogeneous as this label suggests? And is their language really as stable as the critical period hypothesis would have us believe? Gerontological evidence on other aspects of aging, of course, would suggest otherwise, but we don't really know what the story is with language. And these are some of the questions that we hope our research will answer. So our first big challenge was to find a more nuanced way of capturing potential differences amongst speakers of the same age cohort and attributing them to the right source. And the system we're road testing now considers several complementary ways of thinking about age. Chronological age is, of course, straightforward, but arguably more important are an individual's physiological and cognitive states and the extent to which they're still engaged in society. Now, most researchers would just simply query their subjects about these things, but in our case, it's unlikely that any of them are still alive. So we have had to resort to other means to operationalize these measures from our materials, which were originally collected years ago for purely linguistic reasons. And team member Marin Diorio, who has been piloting this part of the research, first mined the detailed metadata assembled at the time of each recording from these interview reports that you can see here. These quite reliably describe speakers' living situation, like if it was in a retirement facility or at home, alone or accompanied. And they also provide some information about employment status and also health. But far more useful is what people talked about during the interviews, and these just contain a wealth of personal details. Here's an example of what I mean from Heather, a 70-year-old woman who clearly has a very active social life.
So, like, I bowl down here. There's a bowling alley. I go every Monday afternoons. You know, I go with Phyllis, and I've been bowling for Phyllis with years and years and years. And as I say, I know Norma, and, you know, I have this gang, and I have friends around here. Now, tomorrow I'm going out with the girls from the railway for lunch. We meet maybe once every couple of months.
So Marin embarked on a systematic content analysis of all of these data to extricate whatever cues she could find regarding physical state, as in these examples.
And then we had a group of 8 that we used to meet in each other's houses and play bridge. And that was, well, I just felt terrible. I didn't know what was wrong with me. But then my heart started to flutter. So I went to the hospital, and they gave me 5 pints of blood and said my blood was so low. And that's why I stopped going, like, on a Tuesday and a Wednesday.
No, I'm pretty healthy. Of course, I mean, I was very active all my life. And my doctor tells me I'm going to live till 100. And I said, God forbid.
And we also got information about people's activities.
It's fun in 50 Less Glum.
Yeah. Do you go to that?
Oh, yes, I belong there, yeah.
I've no way of getting to church now. I can't climb those stairs.
And we learn about their social networks, as in these examples.
Well, I have my daughter.
Yeah, she lives
Here with me. My son lives down the road here.
Yeah.
Like if I go to any place, go to church, there either she drives, she goes to church too, or my son picks me up.
Yeah, she says she misses that she doesn't get very many people to speak to. I do too.
Yeah.
Very much. I used to have 3 people here I used to go and visit, and they'd come and visit me. They're gone.
And we even got some indications of cognitive ability.
If I stop learning, the day I stop learning is the day they close the casket. Because to me, if you don't learn something new every day, then your mind can get dull very quickly. Do you know, I do the Globe and Mail crossword puzzle every morning, and I usually finish it.
Is this the morning?
Yes, it's the morning. It's Saturday morning. Saturday morning.
There's somebody who's supposed to interview me. I guess it was you, maybe.
It's me.
Oh, true.
So far, we've tallied over 1,600 mentions like these from 52 speakers and converted them into relative scores that position them on continua of what we're calling physiological and social age. And one caveat I should mention here is that due to our criteria for inclusion in the original research, which was that participants be able to carry out at least 1 hour of conversation, we are basically dealing here with relatively cognitively healthy, maybe third age individuals. But still, the fact that they differ on other measures, as you have no doubt noticed from the conflicting observations you heard from age mates, should allow us nonetheless to tease apart the effects of different factors. And by way of example, consider social participation. Here, our speakers covered the full spectrum, ranging from a low of 12% for a 75-year-old widow who lives alone with no close family ties or group activities, to a high of 82 for a woman of the same age who lives with her husband, has a kid across the street, interacts regularly with other family members, volunteers with friends on Tuesday nights, bowls regularly, plays petanque, and on and on and on. And when we examine the relationship of sociality with chronological age, we do discover the expected correlation, as can be seen by the dotted blue line. The lowest scores are concentrated among the oldest speakers. But the fact that the high scores are by no means limited to younger speakers reflects the complex reality that speakers of like ages may not enjoy the same levels of interaction. And that's a fact that's driven home by the situations of these 2 women, both of whom are aged 74.
Do you go to the Holland Center or the 50 Plus Club or anything like that?
Well, I belong to it, but the 50 plus, but I haven't been to it. As I say, well, it's not quite. It's almost a year, but it's not quite. I really haven't been very far in this past year, so it's just been moving quite slowly, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, there's an English 50 plus and a French one, and we join the 2. So we can go to all our parties and dances, and by going there, we go half price, you see. So if the party's $15, we can go for 7. We go up to dance, and her and I, she's lost her husband too, so now we've learned how to waltz and do all the dances together. So come on, Veronica, let's go. We're going, yeah.
Already there is ample research evidence that social isolation is detrimental to successful aging. So our social age metric will additionally reveal its impact on the integrity of the linguistic system. As I said, we are particularly interested in the question of whether older individuals do in fact shift their speech to participate in ongoing changes in the community, contra the critical age hypothesis. To do so, you would have to be exposed to those changes, and those who score low on social participation presumably would not be. So we want to be able to distinguish reduced sociality from the inability to change. And that's what these measures are for. Runza Qian is working on another set of measures that targets potential attrition in actual speech production. And these capture what we call speech age. And speech age offers another means to distinguish individuals, this time according to their discourse fluency or lack thereof. So first, very rough assessment of overall verbosity or chattiness comes from a simple count of the number of words produced by each individual. Because although the recordings were all at least an hour long, some speakers opted for much longer and richer interactions. By plotting the number of words produced against chronological age, we first learned that in the aggregate, older speakers are only slightly less verbose than their younger counterparts. And you can see that from the trend line in the scatter plot on the left, but also from the lower, median, and relative positioning of the boxes on the right. Other analyses test whether aging affects speech fluidity. And we captured fluidity by calculating the extent to which each person's output is characterized by hesitations, like these.
So they would go to the West Coast to meet the fellows coming back from, was the Korean War at that time, wasn't it?
And also how often their speech is interrupted by false starts.
They passed away or they moved away?
Now, one woman moved, and then another two women, they passed away. Yeah.
And here we find, predictably enough, that older speakers display a greater number of hesitations than false starts relative to their younger counterparts. But the box plots also show some especially disfluent outliers highlighted in yellow, and future work will, of course, reveal who they are and what their individual age profiles, chronological, physiological, and so on, might explain about their behavior. A third measure of fluidity derives from vocabulary richness. So by dividing the number of different words by the total number of words produced, we learn that older speakers actually have somewhat more extensive vocabularies than younger ones. Frankly, this came as a bit of a surprise to us, although this vocabulary advantage is a well-documented finding in the neuroscience literature, for example, in the work of Park and Associates. But still, as far as we're aware, our study is the first to find evidence of this tendency in spontaneous speech production. In other words, actual usage on the fly instead of in the lab. So we're still working on these and more measures, and we have yet to apply them to our Francophone cohort for purposes of cross-linguistic comparison, but we're hoping that these different perspectives on age will reveal not only where speakers are positioned relative to both chronological age mates and counterparts from other age cohorts, but also how the measures relate to each other and to various aspects of speech production. And then by operationalizing them as independent variables in statistical analyses, we hope to clarify which, if any of them, actually do affect speech production in older age and in what way. So at this point, you're probably wondering exactly what it is that we'll be looking at in terms of speech production, and I'll get to that in a minute, I promise. But first, I need to explain a little bit more about our research framework, which is the framework of variationist sociolinguistics. And this approach rests on the observation that I invoked earlier, that when we speak, we're constantly making choices among different ways of saying the same thing. And this is the phenomenon of inherent variability, which in turn happens to be the hallmark of speech. Now, variability shows up at every level of linguistic structure. It's, of course, most obvious in the vocabulary, like do you say cabin, cottage, or camp to describe your holiday place, voiture, char, or auto, and so on. But we can also choose how to pronounce certain vowels and consonants, as in this example.
I mean, when I'm talking franglais. And I said, if things don't change around here, I'm getting out of here.
And we can even decide whether to pronounce them at all.
My sister's girlfriend, she lived with her grandmother. She didn't have much, so she used to be at our place a lot.
And even the way we treat grammatical elements, like which conjugations we select, is subject to choice. As you'll remember from this example, I showed a future temporal reference. And at a broader level, variability also affects how we structure our sentences, like where we place our prepositions. Le gars que je sors avec, or ça dépend avec qui, and even if we feel like saying a preposition at all. Il y avait un gars que je parlais, for example. It also affects our entire discourse as a whole, as I'll be showing you in a minute. But for now, these choice points are the linguistic variables that I alluded to, and the choices themselves are known as variants. So I said earlier that decades of empirical research, not just by us, but worldwide, have confirmed that variant selection is never random. It is robustly conditioned by elements of the linguistic environment and also by elements of the extralinguistic, that is the real world context in which these things occur. So I'm talking about things like a speaker's gender, occupation, educational level, bilingual ability, and in this case, especially chronological age, as well as the other age metrics we're developing. And this conditioning is a proxy for the grammar or the structure of variability, as I said. And since we already know a lot about the grammar of the larger Francophone and Anglophone speech communities from which these golden age cohorts were drawn, we can make use of this information to situate the older cohort with respect to community norms. And what we want to know is whether the older speakers adopt innovations that are current in the community, if the distribution of variance changes in old age, whether the conditioning of variability remains intact or not, and perhaps most important, did simplification occur in either variant distribution or conditioning? And if so, can it be related to one of the age metrics that we have identified? So just as one fun example of what we're after, let's take the case of the widely reviled discourse marker like illustrated in this example.
2 weeks later, I'm like on my deathbed. I'm so sick at home. I get a call from this guy who I'm like friendly with, but never speak to on the phone. And he's like, hi, I just wanted to, whatever, I'm just calling. I wanted to know, like, my friend saw you at the New Year's party and he thinks you're cute and he wants your number. So I'm like, okay. I was like, is he, like, I mean, I knew what he looked like, so I knew he was cute, so I'm like, okay, is he a nice guy, whatever, and like, and I mean, they're friends, so obviously he's like, yeah, you know, we've been friends for a long time, we know each other, he's a really nice guy, blah, blah. So I'm like, okay, but just let him know I have mono.
Now, most people think of this like as being a relatively new thing and being driven by young women, among whom it's supposed to be especially prevalent in their speech. So of course, we wanted to know if it had managed to infiltrate the repertoires of the 65 plus cohort. And Marin has been helping us figure this out. So to our surprise, we found quite a few, like 2,000, as in this example from 78-year-old Catherine Vincent.
Everybody misses the downtown. Like the big box stores aren't the same as going in and out little boutiques.
Actually, it turns out that nearly all of our older speakers used like in this way at least once, albeit not equally often. The older the chronological age, the fewer we see, not surprisingly, while those who use it the most are under 77. But social age also matters. The 6 speakers who never used like score low on the social participation metric, while the most prolific users tend to rank highest. This suggests that given a socially favorable scenario, the linguistic system may be altered to accommodate incoming forms, contra the critical age hypothesis. And this observation is only bolstered when we consider where like is being used, what we were calling the conditioning. Historically, this form developed from a sentential adverb that related what was about to be said with what was just said. So like first appeared in sentence initial position, but as it evolved, it started to spread to various points within the sentence also. And work on Toronto English breaks down its progression across various positions in the sentence by age, and this gives us a sense of which environments are the most novel. We've only just begun examining our own data in this respect, but we can already state that older people use it in some of the most innovative linguistic contexts, such as immediately before the lexical verb of the clause, as in this example from an 80-year-old.
I would look into the kindergarten class and there were all the toys and children were playing, and here I was like learning, reading and writing and whatever.
Other variables that we're working on are meant to capture various other aspects of production. And one set that Billy Nell has been helping us with relates to the production of phonetically taxing segments, as in this example.
I traveled first class, and we were between Montreal and Kingston all the time.
We might expect, for example, that clusters of consonants, such as the ld in traveled or the st in first, would become increasingly difficult to produce as speech organs deteriorate. And a perfect test of this possibility comes from this well-known and widely studied variable, which is called TD realization, in words that end in consonant clusters. All over the English-speaking world, speakers of all ages have been alternating between pronouncing and deleting these final T's and D's. But the beauty of this variable is that it also permits a test of the integrity of the grammar, because a variety of factors affect their selection, the most important of which is semantic, because T and D are retained most frequently in the community grammar I'm talking about when they convey grammatical, in this case, past tense information, than when they don't, just as Maeve Parsons did when she was saying this sentence. So the question is, do our golden age speakers respect linguistic constraints like this one, or do they degrade, especially if conflicting factors like physiological ones lead them to delete more often? In other words, does the choice between an overt T or D and phonetic 0 start becoming more random over time, or is the variable structure maintained? Well, we started addressing these questions in a small pilot sample, and we find that deletion is in fact more common for speakers over the age of 90 than those who are younger. And this suggests that avoidance of complex clusters is associated with increasing age. But interestingly, the choice process itself looks quite stable. Deletion may well be on the rise, but the well-documented semantic constraint that I just described appears to be maintained. You can see that T's and D's resist deletion when they convey this grammatical, this past tense information. But still, closer inspection cautions us, reminds us that amalgamated rates may be obscuring individual differences. So this breakdown shows 2 outliers. Speaker 17, a 93-year-old woman who lives in a nursing home with little social interaction. For her, deletion is just as likely whether T or D carries meaning or not. For number 20, an age mate who lives with his wife, engages in many activities, takes the bus, and so on, the distinction continues to operate, but only weakly, and this suggests that it may be neutralizing. So of course we need additional data to see what's going on, but if it turns out that deletion is in fact no longer affected by this constraint for these speakers, it would suggest a simplification of the conditioning that operates for their age mates and for younger counterparts. And this, of course, is precisely the type of situation where we'll be appealing for further clarification to the other age metrics that we are developing. Another set of variables we're investigating tests simplification of the grammar by targeting the relationship between cognitive decline and syntactic complexity. One example of how we go about this comes from question formation, where the variants themselves differ in terms of complexity. So when English speakers ask yes/no questions, they may invert the subject and the verb, as in this example.
Have you been learning Swedish?
So first the verb have, and then the subject. This involves an extra operation, syntactic movement, but they can also formulate a question without moving anything by simply incorporating a high rising intonation to signal that they're asking something, not stating it. Here's an example of a non-inverted question from our data.
You saw My Fair Lady?
Yeah. So here, a simplification hypothesis would predict a decrease of the syntactically complex inverted structure in old age. But in actuality, preliminary results show that overall, Golden Age speakers select inversion, the more complex option, a healthy 71% of the time. But when we break them down by chronological age, we see some evidence that the oldest among them avoid the inversion variance somewhat more than the younger counterparts. An interesting angle that this variable offers is that the factors known to condition the choice between these two types of questions themselves embody their own levels of complexity. So for example, whether the question is negative or affirmative has an effect, because inversion is less likely with the more complex negative clauses. Here again, I'm talking about the community grammar, what we know of the community grammar. Verbs that call for complements disfavor inversion, as do questions that involve longer subjects because they're more challenging to process. So by digging into the relative importance of these community constraints in our Golden Age cohorts, we expect to be able to assess whether simplification in fact occurs in a granular way and how. So the hope is that the analyses will be running on these variables, and the many others that I don't even have time to tell you about will provide answers to the four basic questions that we're asking about the integrity of speaker grammars in older age. Now, in parallel to this stream, we're simultaneously investigating how broader discourse strategies may be affected by aging. And this line of inquiry, which Catherine Rochon is taking on, will in turn yield a different type of insight into social age. And this involves analyzing narratives of personal experience, which we construe as a social act relying on audience design in very specific ways. So along with the above, we define a narrative as one means of recapitulating past experience by a sequence of ordered clauses that match the temporal sequence in which the events actually occurred. It only takes two clauses like this to construct a minimal narrative. The kid came in and then knocked me down, a minimal narrative, but fully formed narratives will feature many, many more. And these different sections work together to serve the dual function of telling any story. The simplest function is referential, just to tell somebody what happened. But the other function is evaluative. And this elaborates on the meaning that these events hold for the narrator and even more important, what they want the listener to take away from them. So we can decompose the structure of a fully formed narrative into different sections, which include an abstract, which just is a summary of the story, an orientation, which tells us when it happened, where it happened, what the weather was, and so on. Complicating action, which are the events that actually did happen. Evaluation, which is the point of all of this stuff that I'm telling you, and optionally a coda. Now, analysis of the way speakers manipulate them not only provides key information about discourse coherence as a function of age, but also a measure of speaker engagement with the listener. So to give you an idea of how we go about this, just consider the following short but highly effective narrative told by Aurore Fournier, a participant in the original Ottawa Hull Corpus. And she's telling about finding herself in a car with a drunk driver and emerging unscathed thanks to a divine miracle.
J'avais été à une classe, ils sont tout sous, tout le monde était sous. Moi, je ne savais pas runner, je n'avais jamais runné les chars. Puis là, il fallait qu'ils s'en aillent de là parce qu'on ne s'était pas pour rester là, parce qu'il faisait fret dehors, puis tout. Puis c'était l'hiver, puis tout le monde sont assis, puis le gars, il dit « I'm gonna drive », tu sais. Moi, je bois pas. Puis j'ai dit « God, please help me ». Ils sont tous sous, puis il veut driver, puis moi, j'ai peur quand quelqu'un drive. So, j'ai dit « OK, that's it ». Pow! Je l'ai assommé, j'ai pris la roue, honest to God, j'ai pris la roue, j'ai dit « Bon Dieu, s'il vous plaît, emmène-moi direct à la maison ». Honest to God, il m'a emmené direct à la maison. J'ai runné de 5000 de la classe jusqu'à sa maison à le monsieur. Puis je ne savais pas même si c'était à sa maison. Puis je l'ai emmené direct chez eux. Il dit, le next morning, j'ai couché là avec tout le monde, tu sais, parce que j'avais pas d'autre place. Puis il dit, how did we get here? I said, the Lord brought you. Honest to God, the Lord brought you.
So as you can see on this next slide, only 6 actual sequential events occurred in this narrative. First, the guy said he was going to drive. Then she prayed to God for help. Then she knocked him out, wrested the steering wheel from him, and prayed to God again. And then he led her to the house. And all of these are clustered between clauses 10 and 18. But for a narrative to be successful, it can't be limited to just telling what happened. And here, the reportability is greatly enhanced by her judicious use of evaluation, which, as I said, the purpose of which is to make sure the listener knows how she felt about what's going on, and by extension, what they should feel in return. And this narrator marshals a wide variety of discourse devices to do this, including explicit statements like j'ai peur quand quelqu'un drive, evaluative actions like pow, je l'ai assommé, intensifiers like direct and dret, repetition, honest to God 3 times, the Lord brought you 2 times, j'ai pris la roue a couple of times. She incorporates exclamations like that's it and pow, God, please help me. And of course, the copious code switches to English throughout highlight the quotations and the exclamations. And together, the skillful manipulation of these devices and their strategic placement in the narrative conspire to convince the listener that the events that are being recounted are in fact reportable, even if they are completely implausible, and even if nothing happened, which is the point of this story. It's a story about nothing happening. And in striking contrast, consider this narrative told by Melanie Gunn, who was 93 years old when she responded to the query, have you ever had to call the police?
Once my husband dropped dead out in the winter time.
Oh, really?
He had bad heart, you know.
Oh, no.
He'd been living on pills for years.
Oh, no.
And he, I don't know, I was downstairs at the time, and he went out.
he was going to get the tractor out to clean the road for Emerson was away with the truck to Emerson to come home. But he didn't get to that. He just fell before he got to the garage.
Oh no.
And Emerson just happened to come home. And he looked, and he said, Jesus, he said, that Daddy? And he just jumped on the brakes. He left the truck just standing in the middle of the road there, and he ran in and to see him. So he brought me into the carport there, and he called 911. That's the only time we've ever had to call.
This is also a full-fledged narrative in terms of our definitions, although pretty sparsely populated. There's no question that this is highly reportable, but it's organized quite differently because here, almost half of the narrative clauses simply relate what took place. None are evaluative on their own, as compared with a full third of the narrative clauses from Aurore Fournier. Now, a narrative is also an exercise in impression management. So Aurore portrays herself as responsible because she didn't drink, resourceful because she solved the predicament of having to leave in a drunken state in the cold weather, and heroic because she saved her companions' lives, and also clever enough to appeal to God, courageous because she knocked out the driver, grabbed the wheel, drove without knowing how to drive or where she was going, and still modest enough to decline any credit for her actions because this was all due to the intervention of the Lord. We can construe these as social in the sense that they are directed to the listener. Mulaney, on the other hand, the 93-year-old narrator, comes across as a third party, virtually absent from the situation, despite telling us that she was downstairs during this life-altering event involving her husband and her son. So to what extent are these discrepancies due to the age metrics we're studying? We hope to develop our analyses of storytelling strategies into objective measures of discourse coherence, stance, and social integration. So there are no real conclusions to this talk because we are in the throes of the work as I speak. I don't have time to tell you about the other major aspect of this research, which involves first replicating these analyses in a second condition, first over the lifespan, which we are doing with two marvelous data sets. One is the Up series documentary. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this just in terms of the film period. It's fabulous, but it revisits the same 10 or so individuals every 7 years over a period of 56 years. So this enables us to see in a very systematic way what goes on over a period of about a half a century in a speaker's linguistic production. And the other corpus, which we ourselves are still constructing, corpora, because we have an English one and a French one, where we are tracking Canadian stars over decades. These are stars who appear, whose speech appears in the public record very, very frequently. And throughout all this, we'll be comparing our golden age cohort with their francophone âge d'or counterparts. And we're hoping that our age metrics, coupled with these linguistic diagnostics and our empirical methodology, will eventually help elucidate whether and how language adapts to aging. And any suggestions you might have us to help us accomplish this would be very welcome.